Good evening. Thank you for joining us yet again for another one of our Fireside chats. And I was just doing some reading, and a couple verses jumped out at me. And a little part of one of those verses, it's a pretty well known story, but one of the little statements in here stands out to me, and I'll elaborate here in a minute. But in Acts chapter 14, verse number 19, the Bible says, "And there came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium, who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up, and came into the city. The next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe." And I've heard this story numerous times, and of course read it, and Paul refers to it, and his listing of the things he's been through in his Christian life, as trying to be a servant for the Lord. And so we're familiar with the fact that Paul had upset the Jewish community because he was preaching this gospel that the Messiah was here, where the Jews were convinced this was not the Messiah, and they were wrong, obviously. But Paul was in his road to Damascus. That's the light that hit him, was the reality that this guy, that this Jesus man that he was trying to destroy and destroy his following, had and really was the Messiah. And Paul knew what the Messiah was supposed to be. He knew the prophecies. So when you read this, you see that these people that Paul is now lashing out at him, because he's so burdened for them to understand that this one, Jesus the Christ, is truly the Christ or the Messiah, and he's trying to convince them of that. And so we know about the stoning. Paul was assumed to be dead, and so that's where the story gets kind of interesting in verse 20. Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up and came into the city. So there's really not a whole lot elaborated here. Paul upset the people in what he was saying. They stoned him. They threw him outside the city, and left him for dead. But Paul rose up, and what an amazing story that is, and truly it is. Just came into the city, went on about his business. Two little verses here in this whole write-up of the history of the church, and Paul here is mentioned, and in this story, in this illustration. But the interesting thing that jumped out at me is it says, "Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him." Can you imagine what was going on in the minds of these people? Those disciples that stood around Paul, as he's laying there covered in, I'm sure, mounds of rocks, his body mangled from the effects of those rocks, assumed to be dead, blood everywhere, a brutal scene to say the least. These disciples are standing there. A couple things jump out to me. Why were they still there? I mean, they believed like Paul did. They were at risk by being there. But yet they stood there, which kind of tells me that maybe they chosen to be there. They're going to hang with this guy all the way to the end, and even after, and what a testimony to their faith. Certainly to just stick with the one being killed right in front of them, martyred right in front of them. But the Bible says, as they stood round about, he rose up. Sorrow certainly filled their heart. Grief. Tears were certainly shed as their leader, if you will, lay before them dead. And yet, they were there. And while they were there, because they were there, they got to see God miraculously raise the Apostle Paul. Now, some think that Paul, and maybe so, he was affected by that stoning. Maybe he was. Maybe he had limps, and maybe arms and hands didn't work like they had once worked because of the stoning. I don't know. But what I do know is that a bunch of disciples decided to faithfully follow Paul because they knew Paul was following Jesus. they got to see an amazing miracle by God. I wonder what would happen if a group of Christians today would just determine to follow God. Just follow. It doesn't matter what bad happens, I'm going to follow. Determine in our heart to follow him, and maybe we'll see some bad stuff. But in the midst of the bad stuff, we'll get an opportunity to see the good stuff. What a great story. What a great thought. That if we'll just keep doing what we're doing and supposed to do and follow God, he'll let us see some amazing things. God bless you. Have a great week. Goodbye.